My name is Malene Harper, and I used to believe that 10 years of marriage symbolized safety, security, and trust. However, everything changed one evening. It was supposed to be our anniversary, marking the decade since Ethan and I had vowed to be together forever under a canopy of garden lights. To celebrate, he whisked me off to the Crescent, the city's most extravagant restaurant, where success wasn't just tasted but performed. The chandeliers sparkled like stars above us, while the city skyline provided a breathtaking backdrop. I wore a navy silk dress that was simple yet elegant, showing that I still cared. Ethan, as always, looked sharp in a crisp black suit, dark tie, and a touch of the cedarwood cologne that used to bring me comfort. As we sat down at the table, he greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Happy anniversary, Mads," he said, raising a glass of Cabernet in a toast to us. I clinked my glass against his, but even then something felt off. It was a subtle change in his demeanor, a shift in his energy that left me unsettled. His demeanor was smooth, almost rehearsed, yet strained underneath. His furtive glances at his phone outnumbered those directed at me. His fingers tapped the table while I attempted to engage him in conversation about his day. Perhaps he was simply fatigued, or perhaps I was overanalyzing, but deep down, I couldn't ignore the truth. Something had felt amiss for months. Late night phone calls dismissed as work emergencies, sudden weekend meetings, a gradual chill in his affections. The man who had once eagerly stayed up all night helping me craft my first pitch deck seemed to have vanished. That evening, beneath the glow of the city skyline, I experienced a profound sense of loneliness unlike anything in our 10 years together. At the time, I was unaware of what he had in store for us. Little did I know that the night would conclude in a trip to the hospital, forever altering our lives because of a glass of wine. Yet I sensed that things were askew, and in hindsight, the signs were unmistakable. They weren't overt or clamorous. Instead, they were subtle, insidious presences. They were easy to overlook, even easier to rationalize, but they were undeniably present. Ethan and I had always. We've always been a power couple in the eyes of others. He ran an investment firm with a shiny office and designer suits. I built my consulting agency from scratch. People admired us, thought we had it all figured out, and for a while we did. But over the past year, things had shifted. Ethan became distracted, less present. It started small, missed calls, vague answers about where he was, why he was late. I told myself he was just under pressure. Big clients, tight deadlines. I knew that world too well. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living with a stranger. He'd sit at the dinner table and barely touch his food, scrolling through his phone like it held a secret he couldn't share. When I asked about his day, his answers were clipped, guarded. "Same old," he'd say with a shrug. "You know how it is." But I did not really. The intimacy we once had, late night conversations, spontaneous weekend getaways, even small rituals like cooking together on Sundays, had disappeared. In their place was silence, or worse, politeness. Once I inquired if there was something bothering him. He glanced up from his laptop, forced a smile, and replied, "No, just tired, babe." But his eyes revealed the truth. He was not just tired, but emotionally distant. A few weeks before our anniversary, I discovered a second phone in his gym bag. It was unlocked, yet completely empty. No contacts, no messages, just a blank home screen. Though I wanted to believe it was insignificant, my intuition told me otherwise. That night, as I lay beside him, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, I pondered how we had ended up in such a situation. Two individuals inhabiting the same space, yet living separate lives. Despite my doubts, I hesitated to confront the unsettling reality. I clung to the hope that our relationship was salvageable, that this was merely a passing phase. However, sometimes what we label as a rough patch is actually the beginning of the end. Excusing myself midway through the meal, under the pretext of freshening up, I simply needed a moment to gather my thoughts. The tension at the table was unbearable, like sitting across from a mask you used to love. The hallway outside the dining room was quiet, with dim lighting, polished marble floors, and a soft jazz tune playing overhead. I leaned against the wall for a moment, closing my eyes. My heart was racing, and I didn't even know why. That's when I heard someone say my name. Not mom or excuse me, but my actual name, Mrs. Harper. I turned around. It was the waitress who had been serving us all evening. She looked barely 20, with her dark hair braided and tied back neatly. Her name tag reads there, but now her expression was different, tense, serious. She glanced nervously around before stepping closer. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she whispered. "But I need to tell you something." I blinked. "What is it?" Her voice dropped even lower. I I saw your husband put something in your wine. Everything inside me went still. She rushed to explain when you'd out to go to the restroom. I was clearing the table nearby, so I saw him pull something from his coat. I watched in disbelief as he casually retrieved something from his pocket and dropped it into his glass. It dissolved rapidly. The way he did it didn't sit right with me. I exchanged a glance with her, unsure of what to make of the situation. Poison? Are you sure? I questioned, my voice filled with a sense of dread. I'm positive, she replied, eyes wide with concern. I've seen him do this before. He always seems so calculated and cautious. The reality of her words felt like a weight pressing down on me, causing the hallway to feel suffocatingly narrow. Sarah's urgency to return undetected interrupted our conversation briefly. As she hastily excused herself, she emphasized the importance of sharing her discovery, driven by a sense of moral obligation. Left alone in the restroom, I stood frozen, my hands clinging to the sink and my clutch bag. Doubts crept into my mind, hoping that Sarah had misjudged the situation. Maybe Ethan was innocently stirring sugar. However, a deep instinct told me something wasn't right. The unsettling realization began to sink in that the man I thought I knew may not be who I thought he was. 10 years had passed, and aside from being just a stranger, Ent might have evolved into something far more ominous. Standing before the mirror, I gazed at the woman clad in a navy dress. Her visage seemed familiar, yet somehow altered. Her eyes weren't really weary. They held a sharpness tinged with fear, yet also clarity. A choice lay before me. Should Sarah be mistaken, I risked appearing foolish and paranoid. However, should she be right, I could ill afford to dismiss her warning. With a deep breath, I smoothed out the wrinkles in my dress and retreated back into the hallway. The once enchanting hum of the dining room now felt like an overwhelming cacophony. Every sound seemed amplified. Every laugh, every clinking glass, every dancing flame from the candles. Upon returning to our table, Ethan scarcely glanced up from his phone. Everything okay? He inquired, sliding his phone face down. Yes, I replied lightly. Just needed a moment. He flashed me a smile. For sure? You seem pale. Headache? Nothing serious, I assured, settling into my seat as my gaze drifted to the 2 glasses of Cabernet still waiting untouched. Sitting on the table, mine was on the right where I had left it. His, untouched, was on the left. Somewhere inside one of them, a lie waited. I made my move casually, hiding it behind a stretch and a quiet laugh. I reached for my glass, then paused. This wine's too good to waste, I joked. And in a single smooth motion, I slid his glass toward me and nudged mine to his side. He didn't notice. His eyes were back on his phone, his fingers tapping some urgent message. I took a small sip. It tasted rich, slightly dry, just like always. But the wine sat heavy on my tongue, the bitterness blending with dread. For 10 more years, I said, raising the glass, my eyes locked on his. He looked up, surprised for half a second, then smiled thinly and raised his own glass. 10 more, he echoed, and drank deeply. I watched his throat move, watched the wine vanish from my glass, his really still half full. A strange quiet settled between us. I kept smiling, even as every part of me screamed. Had I just made a huge mistake? Had I tested something? I wondered if what I had just done was non-existent, or if I had inadvertently set Ethan on a path that went against his own intentions. At that moment, I wasn't certain. What I did realize as I held the incorrect glass in my right hand was that I had stopped being passive. I was no longer the woman waiting to be acted upon. I had become the observer, the listener. And if his intentions were to harm me, then I had managed to disrupt his scheme. Initially, there was no reaction. Ethan leaned back in his chair, casually wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He appeared at ease, perhaps too relaxed. A calmness that stemmed not from comfort, but from a belief that he was in control, that everything was proceeding as planned. I twirled my fork, feigning composure, though my fingers shook slightly, causing me to conceal them beneath the table. I kept a close watch on him, noting every blink, every breath, every anxious glance towards his watch. With a light tone, I inquired, how's that significant deal progressing? The one that has been keeping you awake at night? His eyes narrowed ever so slightly. It's complicated, he said with a clipped tone. Big stakes, high risk. You know how it is? I nodded slowly. Sure, but you've always liked the high stakes games, haven't you? He didn't respond, just reached for his water and took a small sip. Glancing at my wine glass, then at his own, he paused. You're not drinking much, he noted casually. Saving it, I replied with a sweet smile. This one deserves to be savored. His fingers drummed against the table, first faster, then slower, until they stopped altogether. A few seconds passed before he coughed. Once, then again and again, dry and quick. My heart pounded in my chest as he brought his hand to his forehead. "You okay?" I asked. My voice steadied despite the storm inside me. "Yeah," he muttered. "Just tired?" But he didn't look tired. His face had lost color. A thin sheen of sweat forming at his hairline, his eyes blinking rapidly and unfocused. His hand trembled as he reached for his wine. My wine missed the glass. It tipped, spilling across the table like dark. Blood stained the white linen, causing Ithed to groan and slump forward, making the chair legs screech against the floor. His body seemed to lose all strength, as if the strings holding him together had been severed. A gasp came from behind me and a waiter dropped a tray, the dining room falling into a sudden silence as all eyes turned towards us. "Call 911, I shouted, panic rising in my voice. Sarah appeared beside me, face drained of color as she looked from within to me. My husband of a decade was not just sick. He was falling apart right in front of me. It was clear to me in that moment that the drink he had intended for me had backfired on him. His plan had failed, and I had narrowly escaped it. As we sat in the cold emergency room, a sense of eerie stillness enveloped us. I sat in a plastic chair, the navy silk dress I wore now wrinkled and stained with wine. The same wine that had almost brought my demise. Everything around me felt distant. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights, the hum of a vending machine, the murmuring of a news anchor on the TV screen mounted on the wall. It felt as if no one was paying attention. I hadn't made any phone calls. Who would I even call? My parents had retired to Florida. My colleagues believed I had a perfect life. I wasn't prepared to tell them that my husband may have attempted to poison me. My hands were tightly clenched in my lap, still shaking. The scenario kept playing in my mind. The way he glanced at my glass, the way his body reacted, the way I just stood there watching. Suddenly, a door opened. A doctor in a white coat entered the waiting area, scanning the room. "Mrs. Harper?" she inquired. I stood up, feeling my knees slightly give way. "I'm Dr. Pato," she introduced herself, leading me to a quieter spot. "Your husband is stable, but he's sedated. He consumed a high dose of a controlled sedative, diazepam, not the kind you get over the counter. It was highly concentrated and potentially lethal if not treated." My mouth went dry and I swallowed hard. I believe that was meant for me," I admitted softly. She raised her eyebrows slightly but stayed silent. A waitress had warned me that she saw him tamper with my drink. So I switched our glasses. Pato's nod was deliberate, her voice steady as she acknowledged. That would provide an explanation. The level of the dosage in his system was well beyond safety limits. It's fortunate you took action promptly. I turned my gaze away, feeling a lump form in my throat. Uncertainty clouded my thoughts. A part of me resisted accepting the harsh reality. Pato placed her clipboard against her chest, declaring involving the authorities is necessary now. This has transitioned from a mere medical emergency to a legal issue. You made the correct decision. But was it truly the right call? I found myself stuck between conflicting versions of reality. One where my husband was my loyal partner, my defender, and another where he secretly schemed to harm me, driven by greed or power. Resuming my seat, not to passively wait this time but to compose myself, I pondered the shattered truth lurking behind the hospital curtain. He lay sedated, breathing, yet the unspoken truth hung in the air, exposed and uncontainable. The revelation unfolded sooner than I had braced for, triggered by a call from one of Ethan's former clients, Lacey, who used to praise his financial prowess, but now. 2 days after the hospital incident, her voice was trembling. "I didn't know who else to tell," she said, "but I think Ethan's firm is in serious trouble." That was an understatement. Within a week, everything unraveled quietly and publicly. Ethan's investment company, once praised in local business magazines, was collapsing. Months of bad trades, failed investments, and increasingly risky deals had caught up to him. Creditors were circling. Lawsuits were already being drafted. I found documents hidden in a storage bin in our home office, papers he clearly hoped I'd never see. There were letters from banks, warnings from the SEC, even an unsigned power of attorney form that would have transferred all my company assets to his name if I had been incapacitated. That's what he wanted? Not my death necessarily, but my silence, my disappearance. He needed control, and he was desperate enough to do the unthinkable to get it. He must have thought, if I couldn't speak, if I couldn't act, he'd step in as my husband. I've claimed authority, access, ownership. What broke me most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the calculated patience, the way he smiled at me over dinner, the way he touched my hand, called me mans, acted like nothing was wrong. He was drowning, and he was ready to drag me under just to keep himself afloat. But I didn't drown. I didn't sip that wine. And now the man who once promised to build a future with me was facing charges instead of champagne. All because I listened to a whisper and trusted my gut over a familiar smile. In the days that followed, I moved through life like a shadow. The media caught wind of the story before I was ready. Headlines hinted at scandal, investment star hospitalized after wine incident. My name was there, always paired with his, but no one knew the full story. At least not yet. Some friends reached out confused. Others disappeared completely as if discomfort was contagious. I didn't blame them. Who wants to believe a man like Ethan? Charming, respected, always the one raising a toast? Ass may have been capable of what he did, but I was not interested in saving face. My focus was on uncovering the truth. So when the detectives reached out, I didn't hesitate. I disclosed everything, from Sarah's warning to the glass swap, from the concealed documents to the storage container filled with secrets. I handed over all the evidence, emails, notes, and even my personal journals. Ethan ended up being charged with attempted poisoning and other crimes tied to financial fraud. His attorney attempted to justify his actions, claiming it was all a misunderstanding or due to mental instability caused by pressure. However, having lived alongside that mind for a decade, I could distinguish between instability and calculated strategy. I chose not to attend the initial court proceedings. Instead, I stayed at home, sitting quietly by the window, sipping tea from a mug. Ethan never appreciated the honest gray sky outside. I didn't shed tears at that moment. Instead, I sat down at my laptop, opened a blank document, and began to write. Not about seeking revenge or fueled by anger, but about survival. About how at times, the most perilous place for an individual is within their own mind. Omen is not a dark alley, but rather the familiar setting at the table with the man who professes love for her. It is about trusting your instincts, no matter how softly they whisper, as it is not just an act of courage, but also a way to protect yourself. I cannot pinpoint the exact moment when I shifted from seeing myself as a victim to realizing my own strength. Perhaps it was when I changed my perspective, or maybe it was when I chose to believe a stranger's concerned voice over my husband's composed smile, or maybe it was the instance I stood before a mirror and saw a woman I finally admired. The ensuing months were challenging, as healing often is. I sought therapy, distanced myself from those who were still invested in the facade of our marriage, allowed myself to mourn not only the relationship, but also the years spent diminishing myself so someone else could shine. And then I started to speak up. It began with small steps, such as participating in a women's leadership conference, launching a podcast, and joining a panel at a nonprofit organization focused on empowering women to identify coercion. Financial manipulation in relationships is a topic that I felt compelled to share about, not for attention, but because breaking the silence was crucial to my survival. I refused to be defined by the events of that night at the Crescent. Instead, I focused on the empowerment that came after. I persevered, rebuilding myself and my career with newfound strength. Offering a helping hand, I hired Stara, the waitress who had warned me, as my executive assistant. Brings me joy to mentor her as she studies business. People often inquire about my feelings for Ethan, and the truth is, I did love him deeply. However, love should never come at the cost of one's safety, nor should it justify betrayal. No one, no matter how close, should ever make you question your reality. If you're following along, and if my experiences strike a chord with you, remember this: trust your instincts and believe in yourself. Don't wait for a catastrophe to validate what your intuition already knows. You've overcome a situation that once seemed insurmountable. Take a moment to acknowledge your strength. While this is Milan's story, perhaps it resonates with. Is yours too? If this touched you in any way, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video, and subscribe to The Art of Revenge, where true stories of strength, clarity, and quiet triumph are brought to light. Your voice matters, and your truth is never too small to be heard.